Good evening and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. I know we're going to have some people coming in a little late. We've noticed over the summer that it's harder and harder for people to get here on time, but we will start on time tonight because I know you're here and want to hear David Barnes talk. I'm Beth Hessel, I'm the Executive Director. It's a pleasure to see all of you. At the Athenaeum, we celebrate an insatiable passion for learning. We nurture curiosity and seek to stoke enlivening and enlightening conversations that spark our hearts and our minds and our spirits. Our members are dreamers and doers, writers and artists, creators and partakers, the practical-minded and the light-spirited. Our members are you. And if you're not a member, I hope you will want to join and become a part of our community. It's wonderful to have you here tonight. Now, tonight's program is supported by the Charles Wharton Stork Memorial Lecture Fund, which was made possible by endowed gifts made by earlier generations of members and friends. Charles Wharton Stork was a native Philadelphian born here in 1881. He was a graduate of Germantown Friends, Haverford College, and the University of Pennsylvania. Between 1908 and 1916, he was a member of the English department at the University of Pennsylvania. From 1917 to 1926, he edited Contemporary Verse, which was a monthly magazine that he supported in order to give young and unknown poets a chance to be published. Especially in the 1920s, Dr. Stork gained international renown himself as a poet, as a playwright, and as a translator. Has anybody heard or read any of Dr. Charles Wharton Stork's work? His fame has not survived, unfortunately. However, here at the Athenaeum, he is famous and should be famous. You can find his portrait, in fact, it's a really lovely one in our conference room. In 1926, he was elected president of the Poetry Society of America, no small thing, and King Gustavus V decorated him with the Order of Gustav Vasa, First Class, for making Swedish literature known to the English-speaking world. So, as a translator, he was very important, bringing works from other worlds into our realm. Not only did he do all that, but Dr. Stork served on the Athenaeum Board of Directors from 1919 to 1968. Think through everything that happened in the world in that time, during which he founded the Athenaeum Literary Awards. In 1983, his children created an endowment to underwrite an annual Charles Wharton Stork Memorial Lecture, which is traditionally delivered by the recipients of the Literary Award. So it's my pleasure to now turn the lecture over to Dr. Ralph Rosen, Chair of the Literary Awards Committee, to introduce the award and tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Beth. I'm really excited to be here to introduce our speaker tonight, which is David Barnes, Professor David Barnes, an old friend and colleague in Cohen Hall at Penn. We're on the third floor. He's on, second floor. You're on the third floor. But David is here because he was the winner of last year's Athenaeum's Literary Award, of which I'm the chair, or the committee of which I'm the chair, for nonfiction, for his book, Lazaretto, How Philadelphia Used an Unpopular Quarantine Based on Disputed Science to Accommodate Immigrants and Prevent Epidemics. I love that subtitle. It was published last year by Johns Hopkins University Press. So David is currently Associate Professor at Penn in the Department of the History and Sociology of Science, specializing in his research on the history of public health in 19th century Europe, and especially in France. So some of you might know, it's a daunting and humbling task to serve on a literary awards committee. I mean, there's so many amazing books that come through, not so great ones, but many great ones to consider and discuss. But I'm happy to say that David's book last year quickly rose to the top of everyone's list, and you'll see why soon. And we were so pleased to be able to present him with this award last April. So we're doubly pleased now to have David back this evening to discuss this amazing book with us at greater length. So Lazaretto concerns a fascinating slice of Philadelphia history, as we're going to hear, with origins in the 19th century and enduring up to the present. A lazaretto was a term with origins in the early modern period for places of quarantine in times of epidemic. In Philadelphia history, the lazaretto refers to what is described as, what David describes as the oldest quarantine station in the Western Hemisphere and one of the 10 oldest in the world. And it's just down by the airport. Who knew? In Essington, within Athenæum Township. This building, which still stands today, and we'll be hearing more about, I'm sure, is open for self-guided tours. It was originally built in response to a series of devastating yellow fever epidemics in the last decade of the 18th century and was used as a quarantine station from 1801 to 1895, almost a whole century. David's book charts this history in gripping detail, as we're going to hear, telling a story which is as much cultural as it is scientific. And with that, please join me in welcoming David Barnes.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I should mention that in connection with this lecture, I'll be giving a tour of the Lazaretto Historic Site this Saturday. So you can talk to Beth if you're interested, and I look forward to the tour as well. I thought I would start by reading a section from the introduction of the book, which recounts a pretty terrifying incident that happened in 1879, so well into the Lazaretto's years as the quarantine station for the Port of Philadelphia. And then after I finish reading this section, I'll go back and give some context and take you through a little bit of the Lazaretto's history, including the story of how it was preserved and still stands today, better than ever, some might say. Equanimity certainly came in handy in July 1879 when the filthy brig Shasta limped up the Delaware River to Athenæum Island. A soft breeze carried the brig to the Lazaretto, but to Dr. Robinson, it carried the ominous, unmistakable stench of yellow fever, an odor described in the textbooks of the day as a blend of human cadavers and putrid fish. Sure enough, as soon as he boarded, he saw something close to a worst-case scenario. 9 haggard men, famished and out of provisions, 7 of them sick with yellow fever. Even with all 9 working together, they were too weak to heave the anchor over the side. The Shasta's 46-year-old captain, Albert Batson, lay prostrate with a severe case. Anyone in Robinson's position would have detained the Shasta for quarantine at the Lazaretto. It was an easy call. But it was the last easy decision he would face during what turned into a 7-week ordeal of public fear, rumor, outrage, defiance, and recriminations. Anchored at a safe distance from the Lazaretto, the brig was taking on water and needed 3 men at the pumps to keep it afloat. Robinson brought the captain and the 5 seamen sickest with yellow fever ashore, where they were bathed, dressed in clean clothing, and admitted to the hospital. The 2 healthy sailors and the one with the mildest symptoms remained aboard the leaky vessel, where the Lazaretto's steward provided them with vegetables, bread, and meat. The Lazaretto gates were closed, and placards surrounding it proclaimed, "No admittance." Dr. Robinson refused an invitation from the Board of Health to send his wife and 4 children away from the station for their safety. If his family left, he reasoned, the station would be demoralized and staff might leave their posts in panic. I think I can prevent the station from becoming infected and feel perfectly capable of managing everything to the satisfaction of the Board of Health, Robinson told the board. The Shasta's cargo of logwood from the northern coast of Haiti was destined for the Sharpless Dye Works just outside Chester, 3 miles west of the Lazaretto, where a newspaper reported that the sickly brig's arrival naturally excited much anxiety. Before the day was out, rumors were already circulating in Chester that Dr. Robinson was presiding over an open-door policy at the Lazaretto, riding around the community himself and allowing others to come and go as they pleased. Back at the station, Robinson did not have time at first to respond to the criticism in the press. He ordered the Shasta patient's old clothing to be fumigated in a shed with sulfuric acid mixed into chlorinated lime. As soon as the 3 seamen remaining on board were fed and rested, the bargemen used the same mixture to fumigate the enclosed spaces of the brig itself. Robinson privately despaired of Captain Batson's recovery, but he nevertheless managed to maintain a placid demeanor. By July 21st, though, Robinson felt compelled to write to the board denying reports that he had visited Chester after the brig's arrival. He had not left the Lazaretto even for a minute, he insisted. Savvy political observer that he was, the doctor knew that the anxious rumors emerged from a populace still reeling from the Lazaretto's darkest hour in 1870, when its previous physician, William Thompson, had botched the quarantine of the brig home and paid for it with his life. The filthy vessel from Jamaica had spread yellow fever throughout the Lazaretto site and even to neighboring houses on Tinicum Island, killing 18 people, including the quarantine master, matron, and head nurse, in addition to Dr. Thompson himself. The disease spread to the neighborhood around Swanson Street in Philadelphia, where 13 more died. That's right near Old Swedes Church. 2 Chester physicians, led by J.F.M. Forwood, had treated some of the Lazaretto's staff and neighbors during that terrible outbreak, while the Chester doctors and Philadelphia's Board of Health traded accusations of meddling and incompetence. Forwood was left embittered by the events of 1870, believing not only that the Lazaretto was poorly managed, but that it posed a threat to its neighbors. By 1879, that feeling had grown along with the county's population. By then, too, Forwood's brother, Dr. Jonathan L. Forwood, had been elected mayor of Chester. As a Democrat, he operated from a baseline level of distrust toward Republican appointees like W.T. Robinson and the political machine that dominated Philadelphia's municipal government. When the New York Tribune picked up the rumors emanating from Chester and reported that the doctor and other Lazaretto employees came and went at their pleasure, the Board of Health issued a strenuous denial. But the stakes had been raised for Dr. Robinson, who felt the need to carry out a thorough investigation of the charges. The board promptly released the report on the investigation's outcome to the press. In it, Robinson explicitly and positively denied the charges that any Lazaretto officer or employee, except the mail boy and one other whose duty it is to obtain supplies, had left the station for any purpose, and called the charges false and malicious. While the doctor was being attacked in the press, his patients thrived under his regimen of quinine, beef broth, lemonade, and nursing care. All 6 were released from the hospital as cured 13 days after their miserable arrival. Even Captain Batson walked out of the Lazaretto healthy. The fate of the Shasta and its cargo of logwood, however, remained unresolved. With the Shasta's owners pressing for permission to unload the brig so it could be disinfected and readied for its next voyage, Mayor Forwood refused to allow the brig or its cargo anywhere inside the Chester city limits. While the Board of Health's Lazaretto Committee expressed concern about the logwood being unloaded at the wharf next to the quarantine station, the board, in a testament to the trust and esteem that Robinson enjoyed among his nominal superiors, voted to defer to Dr. Robinson's judgment in the matter. What would Robinson do? He would remain vigilant, arguing that the brig and its cargo should stay put for the time being, and that when the logwood was unloaded, it should be unloaded in the stream of the river onto small cargo barges called lighters. His priority, keep the vessel and its cargo as far as possible from populated areas. The owner's agent ridiculed the notion that yellow fever could be transmitted through logwood, noted that the Shasta's rigging was rotting rapidly, and complained that each day of continued quarantine was costing the owners more than $50. The board, unmoved, backed Robinson's recommendation. Meanwhile, Captain Batson was not satisfied with simply being alive. He wanted to be paid, and that would happen only when the logwood was delivered to the consignee on the wharf in Chester. Seemingly oblivious to the battle playing out around his brig and its cargo, Batson went to Chester to arrange the delivery. In a face-to-face confrontation with Mayor Forwood, who expressed indignation that Batson had ignored Chester's official decisions on the matter, Batson shot back with his own contemptuous surprise that a small-time local official would presume to dictate to him what he could and could not do with his own ship, which had already been cleaned to his satisfaction. Forwood seized the opportunity to appear defiant and pugnacious in public, sent Batson packing, and went straight to the press, vowing in one reporter's telling that if the Shasta attempted to tie up at the wharf here, he would blow her out of the water with Gatling guns. Although the Shasta had been fumigated, the mayor insisted that the logwood remained, quote, alive with germs of yellow fever, unquote, and confidently predicted that half of the population of his city would die of yellow fever if the cargo was unloaded there. He promised that he would mount cannons on Chester's old ramparts before he allowed such a calamity. With the Lazaretto physician Robinson and the doctor Mayor Forwood each standing firm, the next move belonged to the Board of Health. On August 14th, 4 weeks to the day after the Shasta's arrival, the board permitted the brig's owners to unload the cargo onto lighters so that the vessel and cargo could be thoroughly fumigated. Because the board's ruling did not rescind the quarantine, which in principle covered both vessel and cargo, it brought the logwood no closer to either Chester or Philadelphia. But it did ratchet tensions up a notch. Mayor Forwood stationed a corps of heavily armed policemen along the Chester riverfront, then rushed to see Dr. Robinson at the Lazaretto. Forwood demanded to know whether the board's decision included permission for the lighters to take the logwood to the Chester wharves. The doctor calmly replied, "I do not so understand it." In other words, no. 5 days after the board's resolution, the owners had done nothing. They did not have a fixed date for delivering the logwood, and they rightly judged the prospect of paying $40 a day to rent lighters for an indefinite period to be an unattractive business proposition. Miffed at the owner's inaction, Robinson told the board that until the logwood was unloaded, he could not properly fumigate it or the Shasta, and that until they were fumigated, he could not release either cargo or brig from quarantine. Although he did not commit himself, he sent a signal to the owners by telling the board that if the logwood was properly fumigated, it might be safe, quote, it might be safe, unquote, to deliver the cargo in Chester. August turned to September and the stalemate dragged on. The Shasta had been anchored off the Lazaretto for more than 6 weeks. Maybe its owners finally understood what Dr. Robinson was conveying in his message and decided to unload the vessel for fumigation, hastening its release from detention. Maybe Mayor Forwood decided that he had already reaped all the political advantage to be had from his bellicose bluster and let it be known that Chester's wharves were open for any and all deliveries. Maybe the owners of the Sharpless Dye Works tired of waiting for their raw material and pressured the mayor into softening his posture. Or maybe Robinson somehow persuaded the various parties that the danger had passed and that the time had come to settle the matter of the quarantined brig and its cargo. No police, no cannons, and no Gatling guns greeted the lighters as they approached Chester on September 2nd to unload the logwood. Robinson confirmed to the board 2 days later that the Shasta had been emptied of her cargo and was, quote, in an extremely filthy condition in her hold, unquote. He ordered the owners to send in a gang of cleaners as soon as he performed a preliminary fumigation to make it safe for them, to scrub with brooms and thoroughly whitewash every surface. When they were done, a more thorough fumigation and final inspection followed. On September 6, 1879, Lazaretto physician W.T. Robinson discharged the brig from quarantine. Shortly after dawn on July 17th, when Robinson had first set eyes on the Shasta and its desperate crew, he must have considered the range of likely outcomes. The deaths of most of the starving, feverish seamen would not have been surprising. The outbreak of 1870 pointed to the possibility of yellow fever spreading at or near the station. But in 1879, with thicker settlement nearby, who knew how much damage the brig might do? An outcome in which everyone survived physically and politically unscathed must have seemed on July 17th most unlikely. Yet that is exactly what happened. All 6 sailors stricken with yellow fever recovered under the doctor's care. No illness broke out at the station, in its environs, or among those who unloaded or cleaned the Shasta or handled its cargo, unlike 1870. In the eye of the political storm, beset by personal attacks, Robinson stayed vigilant while steering a course of imperturbable confidence. He took action that made the difference between life and death. He got food to people who were starving and provided clean beds for people who needed rest. With the board's support, he muddled through while projecting a sense of security and control to skittish politicians and a fearful populace alike. With little fanfare, but with strategic intervention in the press when needed, he navigated around catastrophe. That's the story of the Shasta in 1879. I think Robinson offers us a particular kind of model for public health leadership in a time of crisis. And I don't want to overdo the parallels with COVID, but I think there are lessons we can learn. This is a time when the germ theory of disease was just in its infancy. There were, of course, no antibiotics. Antibiotics don't work against viruses anyway, and yellow fever is caused by a virus. But through his combination of optimism, determination, and transparency, Robinson earned the trust of all parties, and all parties understandably, including the merchants who owned the ships that were, could be detained at the Lazaretto, the local politicians, the population at large. All of them were understandably fearful and terrified of another epidemic. He understood their fears, he understood their concerns, he understood the merchants' concerns about, the spoilage of their cargo or the money lost through delays in quarantine, and he listened to all parties, made them feel heard. When he felt it was safe to accommodate them, he accommodated them. When he didn't feel it was safe, he held firm and always erred on the side of caution. A little bit more context. Back to the 1790s, there were 4 devastating yellow fever epidemics that struck Philadelphia. Many of you are familiar with the 1793 epidemic that killed around 5,000 people out of a population of 50,000 in the space of 2 months. Imagine that percentage of people dying in that period of time today. I won't go into it in detail, but I just want to emphasize that it was not just one epidemic in 1793, but the return of yellow fever again in 1797, again in 1798, again in 1799, that really instilled a widespread sense of dread in the population, just waiting for the next shoe to drop, waiting for the next epidemic. When would it end? Would it ever end? Would this be an annual occurrence? And there were people who genuinely, and with good reason, wondered whether Philadelphia, or indeed any city of any size on the Atlantic coast of North America, was suitable for habitation by people of European descent. Thomas Jefferson, Vice President Thomas Jefferson, in the midst of the 1798 yellow fever epidemic, wrote to his friend Benjamin Rush, a famous Philadelphia doctor, that he hoped that there would be a salutary consequence of this unfortunate epidemic, and that would be the depopulation of Philadelphia and all cities. Depopulation through the deaths of many of the residents, but also through deterring anyone else from settling in a large city. Jefferson, as many of you know, wasn't a big fan of large cities. Thankfully, his prediction was spectacularly wrong. But the sense of dread, the sense of existential angst, the sense that the survival of the city itself was on the line, and it's perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration to say the survival of the nation, but remember, Philadelphia was the nation's capital in the 1790s. It was the nation's largest city. It was the nation's busiest seaport. It was the nation's mecca of learning and culture. Any of you seen Hamilton? You remember New York, the greatest city in the world? The greatest city in the world? No, sorry, not in the 1770s. New York was a backwater. Philadelphia was where it was at. I mean, not compared to the European capitals, but in North America, Philadelphia was where it was at, and the city was threatened with destruction, really, through these repeated epidemics. Okay, and Fresneau's poem, conveys the sense of crisis, and the verse about the doctors raving and disputing, to make matters worse, the doctors who, at the very least, were looked to for some sense of advice for what we should do to prevent the next epidemic, or what we should do to mitigate the damage from any epidemic. All they could do was argue among themselves about what was causing yellow fever and how to prevent yellow fever. The contagionists said it was spread from person to person, and it was imported from overseas, from the West Indies, where yellow fever was virtually endemic. The anti-contagionists, led by Benjamin Rush, said, no, it's not spread from person to person, and it's not imported. It originates locally in accumulations of filth and decaying organic matter under certain weather conditions, and they just couldn't stop arguing with each other, making a concerted response impossible. So, 1799, the Board of Health, which was established in 1794 after the 1793 epidemic, is sort of paralyzed by these battles among doctors, but it decides in 1799 that the existing quarantine on Province Island, later renamed State Island, adjacent to, at the time it was actually named State Island, previously Province Island, next to Fort Mifflin, that was the home of the old quarantine ground, which was occasionally referred to as the Lazaretto, occasionally referred to as the Marine Hospital, that quarantine ground was too close to the city and too difficult to isolate. In other words, it was too easy for people from the city to have contact with the ships, the passengers, and the cargo that were undergoing quarantine. So it was a very deeply leaky quarantine, and therefore clearly not effective in preventing yellow fever. Witness the 4 epidemics of the 1790s. The Board of Health purchased 10 acres of land along the Delaware, farther downriver on Tinicum Island. It's no longer an island, but it was at the time because of the delta of creeks there, and began building the new Lazaretto, a new state-of-the-art quarantine station, which opened for business in the spring of 1801. The new Lazaretto was, in a sense, an act of defiance. You know, it cost a good amount of money. It was a significant investment, and the city was placing a lot of hope in this new institution, and the state legislature rewrote the quarantine laws to make it easier to enforce and a tighter quarantine. And so it was an act of defiance in the face of this danger, but it was also an act of desperation. It was sort of a Hail Mary, like, please, please let this work. This has to work. Did it work? Well, hold that thought. I mean, we're here, but still, hold that thought. Okay. So, how quarantine worked? Essentially, the system was all ships headed for the port of Philadelphia were required by law to stop at the Lazaretto and anchor there to be inspected. And there was a big yellow flag, the international symbol of quarantine, with a black letter Q on it, flying on the flagpole at the river's edge at the Lazaretto. And as soon as there was someone manning the watch at all times, one of the bargemen, and they took turns, and as soon as they saw arriving masts in the distance, they rang the bell to muster the other bargemen and the Lazaretto physician and quarantine master to the wharf in order to go out and inspect the vessels. And the bargemen rowed them out in a lighter. Captain would throw down a rope ladder, and they would climb the ladder aboard the ship. The quarantine master would inspect the condition of the ship itself and the cargo hold and the state of the cargo, looking for defective cargo, looking for foul odors in the cargo, rotting cargo, and the bilge water. If the bilge water were stagnant or foul-smelling, that could be a danger sign as well. Meanwhile, the Lazaretto physician interviewed the captain, administered a questionnaire which was prescribed by law. Where are you coming from? How long did the voyage last? What was the state of health at the port at the time you left? Has anyone been sick on the voyage? Have there been any deaths? What's the nature of your cargo? And lying or dissembling in response to any of these questions was punishable by pretty stiff fines. And then the captain would visually inspect the sailors and passengers, if any, looking for obvious signs of potentially infectious diseases. At that point, the decision was within the Lazaretto physician's discretion. He could, if he saw anything out of the ordinary or any warning sign in the cargo, in the passengers, in the captain's answers, if he had heard reports that there was illness in a certain port and that was where the ship was coming from, he could detain the vessel. He could detain the cargo, he could detain the passengers, or he could detain all of the above, or any combination thereof. For how long? Again, his discretion. It could be just a half a day or 24 hours, enough time to ventilate the cargo hold, or perhaps unload some of the cargo and disinfect it. It could be a few days. It could be a week. It could be 2 weeks or 2 months. Longer than 2 months was quite rare, but not unheard of. If there was a particular busy yellow fever season in the cities with which Philadelphia traded frequently. And the mail went back and forth between the Lazaretto and the Board of Health offices in the city twice a day. The Board of Health met every single day during the quarantine season. And the Board of Health could always overrule the Lazaretto physician. They did that occasionally. They didn't do it too often. But the Lazaretto physician was the man on the spot and who had to make the initial decision. Okay. And meanwhile, anyone who was actually sick was admitted into the Lazaretto hospital and treated there. Okay, Lazaretto, drawing of the Lazaretto viewed from the river in 1856, and watercolor by T.L. Cernia of the Lazaretto around 1860. Okay. I guess to summarize, a lot of the book consists of stories, colorful stories of bickering and muddling through. That's a big part of the history of the Board of Health and of quarantine in Philadelphia in the 19th century. Bickering and muddling through. Is it dramatic? Not especially, but sometimes in that very kind of human sense of like egos and offended, senses of honor and pride. I mentioned the bickering among the doctors in the 1790s and the first years of the 19th century about contagion. After Dr. Robinson, there's a story about Dr. Robinson's proposed reappointment as Lazaretto physician in 1887 that I don't have time for here, but it's kind of an amazing story of backroom political deals and breathtakingly poor judgment on the part of an incoming governor. Meanwhile, the Lazaretto physicians that followed Robinson were just, frankly, hacks. They had medical degrees. Their real qualification was that they were political allies of the incumbent governor, because the governor appointed the Lazaretto physician. Every single Lazaretto physician ever appointed was a political ally of the incumbent governor. The exception of Robinson when after the governorship changed hands in 1882, he was retained by the new Democratic governor for a year at the Lazaretto because of the esteem, the good reputation he had. But then the following year, the governor couldn't resist another opportunity for, doling out political spoils and appointed somebody else. Anyway, Robinson's successors were absolutely terrible. They could not stop picking fights with the Board of Health, and the Board of Health couldn't stop responding to their pettiness with their own pettiness. And it was all, splayed out across the pages of the newspapers, and just frankly embarrassing for everybody, embarrassing for the city of Philadelphia and for the reputation of the Board of Health and quarantine. So lots of bickering, but also lots of muddling through, and there are occasional stories of courage and even arguably heroism among people who were dealing with very stressful, high-stakes situations and dealing with, risking their health or their lives to either to treat patients or to prevent epidemics. Okay. Some more scenes of the Lazaretto, photographed from the 1880s of the Dutch hospital, which no longer survives. The Lazaretto Physician's House does survive, although it's been a little segment of the property was carved off and sold in the early 1920s to the Riverside Yacht Club, and that is now the clubhouse for the yacht club, and they've built some additions, but the core of the building still survives. Yeah, if you're interested, I could tell you about the banquets they held at the Lazaretto. This is the members of the Board of Health with the Lazaretto officers. Now, did it work? Okay, this is the estimated number of deaths from yellow fever from the epidemics between 1793 and 1870. So just looking at that graph, it seems like something changed around the time when the new Lazaretto opened and the quarantine laws were tightened. I can't say for sure that the Lazaretto was the reason why yellow fever epidemics became less frequent and much less severe. The short version, there's a discussion of this question in the book. The short version is that I think it's quite plausible that the new Lazaretto played an important role in the decline in frequency and severity of yellow fever epidemics. There were probably other factors involved as well, but historians and epidemiologists honestly don't really know why yellow fever declined in Northeast and Mid-Atlantic seaports, because the epidemics also became less frequent and less severe in New York, in Baltimore, in other Northeast and Mid-Atlantic seaports. Okay. So I don't have time to get into these, but if you want in Q&A, I can talk about the success rates for treatment in the Lazaretto Hospital. Spoiler alert, they did surprisingly well. Surprisingly small percentage of people with these were the two diseases treated most commonly at the hospital, and they're often deadly, but less often deadly at the Lazaretto Hospital. Why? We can talk about that if you're interested. It has to do with these things, in my view, and there's a smarter and more elaborate explanation in the book of what I call the care cure. It wasn't a miracle, some experimental drug. It was basically nursing. Nursing care, basic nursing care, was often the difference between life and death. Okay, now, after the Lazaretto shut down in 1895, that story is also told in the book, and lots more bickering between the Board of Health and the state legislature, but it was finally shut down. Just as in the mid-1890s, the federal government was taking over responsibility for immigration control and for quarantine. That was the era when Ellis Island was built in New York Harbor, Angel Island was built in San Francisco Bay, and there were a couple of federal facilities opened in Delaware, but nothing like the Lazaretto. 3 years later, the site was rented to the Athletic Club of Philadelphia, who wanted a summer home. They called it the Orchard. This was a country club. It was a summertime retreat from the heat and congestion of the city, an outing along the river. They had hunting and fishing outings there. They had cycling outings there. They played, you can see them here playing lawn tennis. They played lawn bowling, which is sort of like bocce. They played quoits, which is kind of old-fashioned version of horseshoes. They played baseball there, and they had parties. Boy, did they have parties. There's stories of a couple of the legendary parties in the book. And they asked the Board of Health to please remove the bodies that were buried in the Lazaretto burial ground. And the Board of Health complied, and they were reinterred in Arlington Cemetery in Upper Darby, a few miles away. Then, in 1915, a couple of well-heeled members of the athletic club, which is redundant, all the members of the athletic club were well-heeled, they were infatuated with the new fad of aviation. So they bought a couple of what were then called flying boats. Today we call them seaplanes. They bought them in San Diego, which is the only place in the U.S. where you could buy seaplanes flying boats in 1915. And they flew them to Philadelphia, and they taught aspiring pilots to fly at the Lazaretto on the Delaware River. In 1917, as the U.S. was preparing to enter World War I, the U.S. Army took over the seaplane base there, and they taught military pilots to fly at the Lazaretto for a few months before the U.S. entry into the war. And after the war, it continued as a seaplane base and flight school and marina until 2000, at which point the Mills family, which ran the seaplane base, the marina, the flight school, finally decided to call it quits. This is the seaplane base viewed from above in 1929. You can see the main building of the Lazaretto there in the center of the photo. Okay, at that point, in 2000, the property is sold to a developer who proposes to demolish everything and build an airport parking garage. Yeah. Well, that didn't sit too well with historic preservation advocates, nor did it sit too well with Athenæum Township's municipal government and residents. They thought maybe there was a better use for this historic property. So the township government worked out a deal with Harrisburg to buy the property back from the developer and to build a new fire station on the unbuilt half of the property because they desperately needed a new fire station. The preservation advocates said, you know what, when you're preserving a historic site, the one thing you don't do is build new things on the site, so please don't do that. They didn't say it quite as diplomatically as I just did, and it got pretty ugly. Just around the time that I first discovered the site and learned this was going on. Long story short, there was a lawsuit. The lawsuit was settled. The new fire station got built, and then a nonprofit organization was set up to oversee the preservation of the rest of the site, and it consisted of representatives from the township, representatives from preservation organizations, and others that they could mutually agree upon, including me. Fast forward to 2012, after considering, a not very abundant range of options, the township decided to move its municipal offices into the main building of the Lazaretto. They had grant money for a new municipal building, and they had some grant money for preservation of the Lazaretto. They said, let's pool it and move the municipal offices to the Lazaretto, and that will pay for the restoration. It didn't pay for the restoration. It paid for some of it, but the airport's involved. More than half of the airport is in Athenæum Township, so when the airport expands, and which it periodically does, the township protests, and it's all part of a dance, a political dance, which ends with money changing hands and being paid from the city or the airport authority to Athenæum Township, and that helped finance the restoration of the main building, which took forever, and the contractor was very difficult, and it was, overcost, surprise, surprise, behind schedule, surprise, surprise, and they finally finished it. It was amazing. On February 28th, 2020, the township moved into its new offices. And you know what happened next. So that's a short version of the preservation story. Before and after, join us for the tour on Saturday and you'll see for yourselves. And this is what we this is what we have in mind for the future of the Lazaretto. And I just want to say a few words about my experiences giving tours of the Lazaretto and talking about the Lazaretto to various audiences. I've noticed something interesting. I tell some of the stories that are in my book when I give tours, and I tell the stories of immigrants who are going through these harrowing journeys just to get to a new land and start a new life, and the suffering they went through, and the stories of ordinary people, suffering from yellow fever, and ordinary people trying to provide nursing care. And I noticed that among the visitors who were listening to the stories, there's a surprising amount of what seems like really sincere, genuine empathy towards those unfortunate folks in the past who were immigrants, penniless immigrants, literally starving. And whether they're Irish famine migrants or before or after, many of the immigrants arriving at the Lazaretto were in terrible condition. Many of them were indentured because they couldn't pay for the journey. They were victims of essentially a human trafficking network, which I really didn't know anything about before researching this book. And then I notice these people and I think, they're so empathetic. How do they respond to the sufferings of people today who are experiencing very similar things? I think a lot of these folks don't really try hard not to see the suffering around them today. And I think many of us are like that. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to think about the life of the homeless person who's in front of us on the sidewalk. We try really, really hard not to see them. Or they're more or less indifferent. And I don't think they're bad people, and they do have this empathy within them. Anyway, I started to wonder if there's a way where we can leverage the empathy that is within people when they hear about stories from the distant past, stories of marginalization, oppression, suffering. Can we leverage that empathy through storytelling and subtly pointing out the many parallels between the sufferings of immigrants then and immigrants now, or various marginalized communities then and marginalized communities now? Could we leverage that empathy into some kind of empathy today? I don't have an answer, but I'm determined to. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and I'm determined to continue trying to do that, to find out whether that kind of thing is possible. All right, I'll stop there. Look forward to your questions and to the reception afterward. Thank you. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay. Yes. The short answer is no. The Board of Health coordinated with the Navy, and precautions were taken, and there was never a case, to my knowledge, of any butting of heads or contention regarding naval vessels at quarantine. Yes. Yes.
Are there similar stories related to other port cities?
Great question. Are there similar stories for other port cities? There must be. I had my hands full with this city, and no other city had quite as elaborate quarantine system for as long as Philadelphia. New York City had a number of different quarantine stations. Later in the 19th century, they had different quarantine stations for different diseases. I'm sure there are, and I don't know the state of record keeping in other cities. Guaranteed to be amazing stories for New York at the very least, probably Baltimore too, but I have no idea how well the records have been preserved. That's really the, if the stories happened and and there's no record of them, then they might as well not have happened. We don't know about them. So I was lucky in that the Board of Health kept written minutes of every meeting, and they met every day during quarantine season, and all but one of the volumes of minutes has survived till today. And of course, that missing volume is like the critical year when the new Lazaretto opened. But still, and there's abundant newspaper coverage as well. So I'm sure there are stories for other cities. I just haven't had time to find them. Yes. The nurses were women. Well, the nurses were women and men. They were mostly women. There were times when nurses had to be recruited on an emergency basis because the Lazaretto was overwhelmed with patients. And sometimes often the Board of Health would put ads in the paper advertising for German-speaking nurses, because for the first several decades of the Lazaretto's existence, most of the immigrants arriving at the Lazaretto were from German-speaking lands in Europe. Yes?
How do you address a situation during an epidemic where a sizable, widespread portion of the population does not believe in it? Thinks it's a conspiracy, the government is lying about it.
The question is, how do you deal with a situation where a significant percentage of the population doesn't believe that there is an epidemic or that an epidemic is a serious threat and refuses to cooperate with precautions? It never happened during the Lazaretto's existence. This is interesting, nobody liked quarantine. Everybody dreaded it. It was, at best, it was an annoying delay. And, travelers or merchants were so close to their destination, but they had to sit and wait until, some faceless bureaucrat decided to let them proceed. So everybody hated quarantine, but nobody protested the right of the city or the state to detain people for health reasons. Nobody ever. So that's interesting. They did protest individual decisions, like you made the wrong decision with my ship because the place we were coming from was perfectly healthy. You think all of Hispaniola, has a single climate. No, it's very different. And where we came from, it was perfectly healthy. You screwed up, you made a bad decision. So they're protesting that judgment call, but not protesting the right to detain them. And the COVID question is more complicated, but I think some of the traits that Robinson embodied would be useful. Listening to people's concerns, listening to people's well-founded concerns when we're telling them to shut down their businesses, when we're telling them to give up their livelihood, and maybe in their lives, they haven't seen anybody who's sick, or they've only seen people who had mild symptoms. It's not conspiratorial, and it's not ignorant for people to resent or ask questions about a decision that's going to deprive them of their livelihood and indeed impact their health in some cases because of some danger that they don't see in their lives. The true conspiracy, I won't get into the willfully ignorant. Yes?
Question.
So the question is, did Philadelphia suffer more than other cities from yellow fever, higher percentage of folks dying from yellow fever? In the 1790s, without question, absolutely. And then, the answer to your question is yes, in part because Philadelphia was the biggest city, the most crowded city, and the city with the busiest seaport. There were more opportunities for yellow fever to spread. Yeah, so in terms of the percentage of the population, Philadelphia certainly suffered more than any other city. Now, after 1800, as I said, epidemics were less frequent, or after about 1805, epidemics were less frequent everywhere and less severe everywhere. So, but I would say, overall, if you go from 1790 to 1850 or so, after 1850, New Orleans is yellow fever central, and New Orleans suffers terribly from yellow fever, and in part because they had no quarantine. They didn't want quarantine. They were the epicenter of the ground zero for yellow fever in the United States, and they refused to implement a quarantine. So yes, Philadelphia did suffer more than other cities. Okay, sure, yes? The name is Italian, and the first Lazaretto was opened in Venice in the early 15th century, and there's some disagreement over the origin of the name, but the most plausible story, in my view, is that it's named after the biblical figure Lazarus. There's actually two Lazaruses in the Bible. One rises from the dead, and the other is a beggar covered with sores who becomes the patron saint of lepers. And it's that Lazarus who, the patron saint of lepers, after whom the first Lazaretto in Venice is named. And it comes to refer to, it's actually used in other European languages in slightly different contexts, but in English it's used to refer to a quarantine facility and or an isolation hospital for contagious diseases. So.